Please join me in welcoming the Arizona Bioscience Leader of the Year, crowned last night, and our opening keynote speaker, Mara Aspinall.
Good morning. I can honestly say this is the first time I've ever stood on a stage with a cowboy hat on. But I like the Southwest, so this is very cool. But Joan, I appreciate this. I'm honored to wear it. I was very honored last night. Thanks so many of you for being there. But I'm going to take off the white hat while I'm actually speaking. So welcome to White Hat. It is wonderful to have it here in Arizona. And what I'm going to be talking about this morning is shaping the future of healthcare. But to do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of context from my perspective. But more importantly, we then have a fabulous panel coming up that will give us some unique perspectives. And as Joan talked about, this is not just investing only for the bottom line, but investing in a way that makes a substantial impact. We have company creators, company starters, innovators, and facilitators coming up as part of our panel. But let me start now with giving you a little bit of context to the market environment from an investor point of view. And during our panel, you'll have the chance to ask questions and interact with our group. So first, I will start by looking at the market. And today is a great day because of those of you who got up early and saw the market open, you heard that today, best 2 days in the market since July. All three of the indexes have hit highs, and as of this week, every single one of the Dow has now up for the year. So it's an exciting time. That being said, it's not all good news, but it's interesting. So if you look at this chart, what you will see is U.S. venture capital over the last 5 years. And you will see that these returns, in terms of valuation from the class of when those investments went in, overall, VC at about 45% IRR. What is that blue line? That blue line is biotech. And biotech returns since 2011 have been better than software and better than IT, and substantially better than all of VC. Why is this relevant? It's surprising to people that it's been so good, but it's been much more volatile, as you can see the change from 2013 to 2014. The reason this does not go out any further is many of the investments that were made in those later years have not yet monetized. So this is the context, and what does it look like? It looks like all good news. But as we know in investing, rarely is there all good news. Usually there's some bad news around it. So what I'm going to say, and I'm not sure, so I put this in the middle of the slide, as to is it good news or bad news? So amidst those fantastic returns, you would argue that biotech investing would be up. And quite frankly, the opposite has happened. So biotech investing, which during this period of time was a high of 22% of all venture funds, down to 17, is now at about 11% of the sector. It's the lowest percent of VC investing in 15 years. I don't know why that is, and we'll ask our panelists later as to what that means. And indeed, is that good news for those who are focused exclusively on healthcare, or is it bad news? Does it mean that they have no friends and no co-investors, or are they the only ones that can get into a deal and have those outside returns? And many of you as individual investors or LPs will consider that in your own portfolio. So that's the overall market. Let me now share with you what I see as what has not changed and what is changing going forward. So 5 key trends. First, what is not changing. And I'll start with my, I say my favorite term, it's not fair, but I'll call it cancer, cancer, cancer. Cancer continues the darling of the investment community and the research community, and you'll see that in a few moments. Secondly, prevention is still the Cinderella. Many of you heard George Post speak last night about the importance of prevention, whether it's an infectious disease or otherwise. Lots of people talk about it. Lots of people say it's wonderful, but very few invest in it. Public health departments are not being funded around the country, and as much as the FDA and others talk about prevention as an important ideal, the president's agenda had it in ACA, virtually no money goes in there, and reimbursement is low to zero to do mass screening and to do prevention. Yes, your flu shot, which you should all get, does not require a copay, but that's the exception, not the rule. Next, drugs don't work as well as we think or as well as we hope. This is obvious. We've been saying this for years and years, but I'm going to show you some data that I think may surprise you. Next, prices will continue to increase. And yeah, I have my EpiPen with me because of my allergies. It's not actually all about EpiPen. Prices have continued much more aggressively in virtually every other area of branded drugs. Why is that, and what's happening with generics? And lastly, imaging is getting better, but I will say it's still not good enough to be a single modality. So again, our panel will argue with that. Feel free to argue it, but that's what I see as the baseline today and what's not changing. Let me share some data on each of those trends. First, cancer still dominates. You don't need to see all the details here. Some of the writing is small, but what you can see is that big purple bubble. That is cancer. The share of the research market keeps going up, its focus is going up, the sales of products is going up, and the sheer volume of research is dominated by cancer. And yes, there are other areas coming along, and what's interesting is if you look at a hospital like Dana-Farber focused on cancer, the only reason they're in some other areas is they had breakthroughs through cancer that now are going into other areas. So as much as neurodegenerative diseases is increasing, which I would have predicted would have been a bigger bubble here, it's not there yet. So we could debate why and how, but it remains, and from an interesting social point of view, I find this fascinating. When you ask people around the world, what is their biggest fear? Public speaking, by the way, is number one, and I'm getting over that. Number two is cancer, ubiquitously. Old, young, different populations, so cancer is still dominating. Secondly, I talked about treatments not working. This is a bit shocking, but it's study after study. If you look at the positive rate, so these are 12 areas of drug treatments, and these are response rates to these treatments. And what you see at the top is cancer. Only 22% of cancer treatments yield the outcome for which the FDA and other agencies expected. 22%. Now, that clearly doesn't mean only 22% of the patients survive. For solid tumors, patients are on 3.2 different treatments because the first one didn't work, the second one didn't work, and maybe the third one works. That's where the 22% comes. As much as we think they work, aspirin for lowering blood pressure, for thinning blood, works in about 60% of us. That's it. Now, it's cheap and it's easy, so nobody's arguing with it, but it only works 60% of the time. So across the entire spectrum, 50% response rate. So you say, yeah, I get that. It must be, there must be drugs in there that are only meant for a small number of people. Well, let's look at the top 10 drugs. These are the top 10 grossing therapeutics in the US today. And Abilify, Nexium, Cymbalta, Humira, Crestor, you've all heard these names. And the little blue people, those are the only ones for which they work. And this, by the way, is appropriate usage, so it does not bring in the fact that a number of people, maybe as many as 30%, don't take as directed. These are patients taking as directed. And what you see here is what we call the number needed to treat. So if you take Remicade for Crohn's, you need to treat 4 to get positive results in 1. Again, 25%. This has not changed. I'll talk about diagnostics because I think it's a better way to deal with this, but this is the reality. Why? My view is that Crohn's disease is not indeed one disease. It's multiple diseases, and we're treating only 25% of the subtypes of Crohn's, but we'll get to that. Drug prices, amidst the fact that they don't work, and I like pharma, but we have to deal with the data. What you can see here, and this is Express Scripts, which is a pretty good indication of the market, and what you see through January 2016, or actually December 2015, is a tremendous increase in branded drugs, 164% over this period of time. Have generics reduced in price? They indeed do. Is this bad? I don't know. The generics industry will not survive without the branded industry, but we have to recognize that an individual problem that happens to get a lot of press is not the answer, because that is one piece of the puzzle. This is broadly across all of the spectrums. Can we deal with this? Maybe, but what are we going to do for the generics industry? But we'll get to that in a minute. Next, imaging. I talked about the fact that what I don't believe is changing is imaging alone doesn't work. Doesn't work well enough, better way to say it. So let's look at a couple of examples. One is traditional imaging. What do you see here? You see structure, but what you don't see is activity. You don't get it. So what happened in the last 10 years, 15 years? PET imaging. And what you see in PET, great breakthrough, you get activity, but what do you lose now is structure. So one modality, one at a time, is not effective. And what you'll see in my next set is its unique opportunity to include diagnostics, molecular and tissue diagnostics, along with imaging. Nothing is an island. When I speak about islands and we go back to cancer, I'll give you one more example of imaging, and some of you may have seen this at Cavendish. Cancer, most patients die, close to 80% of cancer patients die from their metastasis, not from their primary tumor. So for the largest of cancers, breast, lung, prostate, that tumor is taken out and it sits in a laboratory. But there's a recurrence. How does that happen? You don't have no tumor on Monday and some tumor on Tuesday. That tumor is growing at very small increments, and is very small, may indeed start in the blood with liquid biopsy. So what you see here is the best of imaging technologies today cannot see a tumor under 1 gram. So it's what I call the black hole. And we need better technologies to fill in that black hole. Might it be in better imaging systems? You'll hear a little bit about some investments in those companies. We might. But we have to acknowledge today that imaging alone is not good enough. So that's what's not changing. And what I see in the world, I don't want to say in a negative point of view, but we have to acknowledge the foundation. What do I see is going forward? And with, I think, the opportunity to shape healthcare, and again, I have the privilege of being up here, but you're going to argue with me, our panel is going to argue about whether this is right or wrong. So 5 things of what I think are changing and may represent investment opportunities going forward. First, not cancer, but data. It is all about data. Secondly, genetics is becoming truly relevant. While we said this was going to happen when 23andMe and Navigenics and other companies started 10 years ago, we are now making real strides. And my mom, who is just here, she can tell you what her genome is. She hasn't actually done it, but she understands that there's DNA and there's stuff inside that she can't change. Consumers, whether it's through Ancestry.com or 23andMe and its second version of life, are really getting adoption. As prices have gone down, you see Illumina coming up with Helix. I believe that the time is now for consumers to really understand their genetics. Certainly millennials will take it for granted. Researchers as well. We'll get to that. Next, as I mentioned, imaging alone won't cut it. Fourth, combination therapy. Combination therapy may actually work. And the NIH is putting some serious money into proving this. And just like AIDS, where AIDS is all about combination therapy for antivirals, and we have changed the course of a disease in our lifetime. In really one generation, we have changed that disease. Can we do the same with cancer? And while many people have said we've made much progress, I don't have this slide in the deck, we have not made as much progress except in blood cancers as we might have hoped. And lastly, and I have a bias here, is what I see as Diagnostics 5.0, and that diagnostics is finally becoming relevant, and to all of you investors, I hope and believe, truly profitable. So that's what I see changing in the future. Let's talk about it. First, data. And I borrowed this from Tom Miller of Graybird Ventures, my co-presenter at Cavendish earlier in the week. But it's a great, simple slide to talk about how medical practice is moving to an algorithm-based system. So when I talk about data, and we've said, what is big data? What is the Internet of Things? It's truly coming together in what we call algorithms. So the past has been about experience base. Individual doctors using their 5 senses and saying, this is my experience, trust me. And that's not bad. But we move to where we are today, and I would argue where we have been for 50 years, is evidence-based. This was one trial, and this is what's happened. But we're moving forward to saying one trial isn't good enough. One data point is not good enough, but what we have to do is create an algorithm that's specific to that person. In the best way, Watson is a great example of this. And the change in medical education that if you push me, I will talk about, but we need to do is no one physician can memorize everything they need. You know, you watch it on TV, and there's, excuse the doctors in this room, that, you know, you can't get enough cheat sheets and index cards to get into the world of algorithm. We have to think differently. And I believe that time, if not, it's not quite here yet, but it's all going to be about data going forward. How do I give you that context? And I'll put this as the kind of umbrella that wraps around all of it. It's what I see as diagnostics. And very briefly, starting with Diagnostics 1.0, the doctor had the ability to say, using their 5 senses, their hands, their nose, their eyes, their ears, is there disease? We then moved on to what disease is it? Not just was the patient sick, but what do they have? We moved to today, which is what subtype, personalized medicine. The future is about genomics, Diagnostics 4.0, and identifying risk. And lastly, it's what I see going forward, and I believe is investable, which is Diagnostics 5.0 in truly integrated medicine. So that's the context, and let me describe a few things within that context. First, we'll go back to imaging. When you talk about imaging, and I gave the example before of as great as traditional imaging is and PET is, they don't do all of it. Again, this is from Graybird and Tom Miller. And what he would argue here is imaging is the start, but it's only when they add segmentation and then truly taking out the features to then put together an algorithm to have truly integrated analysis. And the analysis adds to these radiology profiles. It's not just about site, it's about the data you see with the site. And interestingly, for much of this work, it's not about an N of 1 and one patient's work. It's the accumulation of experience that that algorithm brings together. What does that mean? I'm going to have a little bit of fun with you first thing in the morning. Star Trek. And many have made the presentation to say, if you go back to Star Trek, what is it now, 35 years ago? A lot of what they created actually has come to pass. I'm not sure it's going to be quite this big. It might actually be smaller than that. But we are going to have handheld scanners. But let's talk about what we have today in augmented reality. This. And if any of you have a Tesla or Chevy Volt, you will see a lot more data in front of you. This is clearly exaggerated, but it's not all that exaggerated. Whether your Waze app tells you you want coffee because it's 7 a.m. and then there's a nearby Dunkin' Donuts. The data is coming to you on a systematic way. And how will that work in the medical field? Again, this is real. Do you go through an interview where you're getting your interviewee's heartbeat along the way? You get their bio, you get their score, you get their Biosciences as you're going through it. And what does it look like in the hospital? Again, clearly exaggerated, but can we fit this operating room and this monitoring all in one small place? I believe the reality is all of these now work today, and the question is, how do we make them functional in the smallest amount of space in an economically rational way? So what else is Diagnostics 5.0? It's integrated technology. Diagnostics is not immune to say that one individual technology will not work. This is an example of whether it's clinical imaging, NGS, clinical trials, and also patient history. The addition of all these new sexy technologies does not, in my mind, get rid of the fact that you still need to see the patient. You still need to see, are they depressed at the same time? You still need to understand their patient history. But what I think changes, and maybe is an investable opportunity, is what I call the diagnostic interpreter. Someone or something that brings together all of these integrated technologies, because again, doctors are smart, but they're not smart enough to do this in real time. How do we do this in an integrated way? Next, I keep talking about integration and the fact that combination therapy and combination technologies are going to work. It sounded good, but as many of you know, getting two pharma to work together, maybe to market a drug, is good, hard. But there's been no systematic way to do a clinical trial where we can test two chemo drugs from two different companies together. So NIH stepped in and with NCI and said, we are going to do fundamental trials, which are called the match trials. So instead of individual companies, for the first time ever, 40 pharmaceutical companies, basically all of the big guys, came together to say, we are going to create one set of trials with 20 treatment arms with 200 actionable mutations. So they are looking at the most common mutations in the most common cancers, and they are doing what TGen and Dan Von Hoff did here in Phoenix with the Bisgrove trial 20 years ago. And they are saying, let's find the right drug for that patient and do it in a way that is irregardless of who owns that drug and who owns the IP. They're coming together to do it. This hasn't gotten a lot of press yet, started last year, and I believe will be the major step forward 10 years from now when we say that every patient will have a combination that works with them, regardless of whose sales rep is in front of the physician. So as I bring this together, I see, and I just mentioned, this paradigm shift, where in the past, we have a drug or a treatment, and the industry has said, find me patients for that. The future is going to be the opposite way. It's going to be physicians actually having, in my mind, more power, and patients having more power, and saying, we have a patient, or I am that patient. Find me the drugs or the treatments that will work. So with that, I'm going to ask my panel to come up and to join me. So now we'll have an interactive discussion, but I'll end you on some fun. The good news and bad news. The bad news is time flies. The good news is you're the pilot. And as investors, you have the opportunity to be more and do more and make a difference in the industry. Thank you, and we'll go to the second half of our presentation.